Something is buried beneath the ice of Antarctica. And I can prove, not that it's there, but that 3 governments within the same decade decided you weren't allowed to know about it. Stay with me. The year is 1840. Between 1838 and 1842, 3 naval expeditions departed from 3 different nations, America, Britain, and France, and each one sailed toward the same uninhabitable continent at the bottom of the world. History tells us this was the spirit of the age: discovery, competition, glory. And for a long time, that explanation satisfied me. Then I started reading what they actually brought back. Not the official versions, the other ones. The ones that were edited, delayed, reclassified, or simply never released at all. There's a line in Charles Wilkes's original expedition log, the American commander, that his superiors cut from every published edition. 7 words: formations inconsistent with any natural process known. That line doesn't appear in the textbook version of his account. You have to find the footnotes. You have to go looking for what was removed. And once you start looking, you discover something deeply unsettling. It's not just Wilkes. It's all of them. Let me walk you through the official record first, the version they'll let you read. Wilkes set sail from the United States in August of 1838 with 6 ships. He traced roughly 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline before returning in 1842. His report was immediately challenged, not by rival explorers, but by his own officers. They didn't accuse him of exaggeration. They accused him of leaving things out. His navigational charts contained features that didn't match what crew members later described in private letters that wouldn't surface until researchers unearthed them decades later. Wilkes himself was court-martialed more than once over the course of his career. He was cleared of most charges, but his reputation never recovered. His Antarctic findings were quietly shelved. His personal journals were sanitized before they ever reached the public. Now consider the French expedition. Jules Dumont d'Urville departed Toulon in September of 1837, pushing south with orders to go further than any French vessel had ventured. He charted what he named Adelie Land, after his wife, and returned in November of 1840 to a hero's welcome. Books were published. Maps were drawn. His name entered the history books. Then, in May of 1842, d'Urville boarded a train at Versailles with his wife and his son. The locomotive derailed. The fire that erupted afterward was devastating. d'Urville, his wife, and his child all perished. Among the personal belongings consumed in the blaze were expedition documents he had reportedly been carrying to a review meeting, not lost at sea, not destroyed in some naval archive, burned on a passenger train in France, 2 years after his return from the ice. I'm not drawing conclusions from that. Accidents happen, grief is not evidence. But I am asking you to hold that detail somewhere in the back of your mind as we continue. The 3rd expedition belonged to James Clark Ross, perhaps the most accomplished polar navigator of his generation. Ross reached what would later bear his name, the Ross Ice Shelf, a sheer wall of frozen water rising as high as the cliffs of Dover, stretching across the horizon for hundreds of miles. He called it impassable. His published accounts are textbook examples of Victorian discipline, measured, clinical, restrained. But hidden in the raw crew logs, the ones deposited with the Admiralty, the ones that scholars didn't gain full access to for decades, there are passages that exist nowhere in the sanitized narrative. One officer referenced geometric anomalies visible in exposed rock faces. At least 2 separate crew journals described what can only be interpreted as structured stone. Not ice, stone. Follow the thread further. It leads to Karsten Borchgrevink, Norwegian-born, British-funded. In 1895, he was part of a whaling voyage that became, by most accounts, the first group to physically set foot on the Antarctic mainland, not simply to chart it from the deck of a ship, but to step onto the frozen ground and walk. 3 years later, He returned with a dedicated scientific team, the Southern Cross Expedition, and deliberately spent the winter of 1899 on the continent, the first humans ever to endure an Antarctic winter by choice. What did they encounter there? This is where the historical record does something I've learned to recognize. It tightens. It becomes meticulously detailed about acceptable subjects: temperature, wind speed, animal specimens, ice measurements. And then it goes strangely quiet about everything else. One of Borchgrevink's crew, a young zoologist named Nikolai Hansen, died during the expedition. He was 29. The official explanation cited a digestive ailment. He was laid to rest on a ridge with a view of the bay. His death occupies a single paragraph in most accounts of the voyage. Another crew member came home and refused for the rest of his life to speak publicly about what he had witnessed. He broke that silence once, a single interview given to a Norwegian newspaper in 1903. The key section of that interview went untranslated into English for nearly 60 years. When it was finally rendered, it described something the journalist cautiously termed episodes of geographic fixation. Members of the crew who became consumed by the belief that they could perceive something organized beneath the ice, something structural, something that had no business being there. Borchgrevink's own writing reveals a strange fracture if you read it closely enough. His logistical entries are sharp and exact. His wildlife observations are thorough, but whenever the subject turns to the interior geology, the appearance of exposed rock in places where wind had stripped the ice away, his language shifts. It becomes vague, almost lyrical, almost evasive. And in at least 3 known passages from his private correspondence, the sentences describing those rock formations are never completed. They either break off abruptly, pivot to an unrelated topic, or exist in versions that diverge significantly from what was submitted to his expedition sponsors. If this investigation is resonating with you, if the patterns emerging here are raising questions you haven't encountered before, consider sharing this with someone. The wider this kind of scrutiny spreads, the harder these silences become to maintain. Subscribe to Tartarian Archive so you don't miss what comes next. Let's look at the physical evidence. Antarctica isn't sealed beneath a uniform blanket of ice. There are exposed rock zones, nunataks, where the continent's actual surface is accessible, where geology can be touched, examined, studied directly. Early expedition members described, again and again, formations in these exposed regions that struck them as deeply abnormal. The specific language varies from account to account: peculiar regularity, unusual right-angle surfaces, arrangements inconsistent with natural erosion. But the underlying observation recurs with a precision that becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Straight edges, repeated geometric intervals. Stone that, in the words of one crew member whose journal was privately published by his family in 1931 and has never been absorbed into the mainstream historical record, fractured in ways that stone should not fracture. Now, a geologist will point you toward columnar basalt. They'll describe frost wedging, differential erosion, the tendency of volcanic rock to split along angular planes under extreme conditions. I've studied those explanations carefully, and I want to be fair. They account for much of what might have disoriented 19th century sailors encountering a landscape unlike anything in their experience. But there is a point beyond which the conventional explanation begins to crack. It's not the angles themselves, it's the pattern of where the angles appear. Crew members from entirely separate expeditions, men who never crossed paths, who, in some cases, served nations actively hostile to one another, who had no way of comparing notes, independently described similar formations at different points along the Antarctic coast. Not the same location, different sites, separated by hundreds of miles. If this were merely basalt columns or frost fracturing, you'd expect the geology to be unremarkable in its repetition. Antarctic rock is, in places, relatively uniform, but when you take the approximate positions described across these various journals and overlay them on a single map, something appears that doesn't align with any known geological distribution. The locations cluster, They suggest intervals, spacing, something that, and I want to choose my words with care here, resembles deliberate placement. Not a single quarry, not one isolated structure. Something far larger, something you would need to stand very far back to perceive as a unified whole. And here is where dismissal becomes genuinely difficult. For the conventional narrative to hold, the one where overstimulated explorers simply misread volcanic rock in a disorienting environment, you have to account for an additional fact. Within the same decade, three independent governments with no shared intelligence and no coordinated agenda all chose to redact, delay, contest, or suppress the unedited field reports from their Antarctic voyages. The United States withheld Wilkes's full charts for years. Some were reclassified entirely. The British Admiralty received Ross's complete officer logs and left significant portions uncatalogued until the 20th century. France published d'Urville's narrative, but French historians have since noted that it diverges from surviving crew diaries in specific, recurring ways. Always the same category of divergence, always the geological observations, always the descriptions of what the exposed rock looked like along the coast's interior margins. Not the temperature data, not the biological specimens, not the navigational coordinates. The rocks. Why the rocks? Three nations, no communication between them, all suppressing the same type of information. The coincidence argument doesn't just weaken at this point, it falls apart entirely. Because for this to be accidental, you would need to accept that three rival governments operating in total isolation from one another, each independently concluded that the geological features of Antarctica were too dangerous to publish honestly, for reasons none of them ever stated within the same 20-year window. Or else something altogether different occurred, something all three expeditions encountered or were informed of that demanded the identical response. I want to be transparent about the boundary between what I can demonstrate and what I can only point toward. There exists a growing body of scholarship, not conspiratorial speculation, not anonymous forum posts, but rigorous work by architectural historians, geographers, and analysts of cartographic anomalies that has been quietly assembling evidence for a prior civilization whose geographic reach was far broader and whose removal from the record was far more systematic than conventional history admits. You may have encountered fragments of this under different headings. The anomalous maps, the Piri race map, the Orontius Phineas map. Charts produced centuries before formal Antarctic exploration that depict southern coastlines with an accuracy that should have been impossible. Coastlines matching sub-ice topography only confirmed by 20th century sonar. Coastlines rendered without the ice that presently covers them. The mainstream explanation that these maps were copied from older, now lost source material compiled by unknown earlier navigators is itself a remarkable concession. It acknowledges that cartographic knowledge of Antarctica existed before any expedition we officially recognize as first contact. It acknowledges that someone reached those shores, surveyed them, and left records precise enough for European mapmakers in the 1500s to reproduce them with identifiable accuracy. What it never addresses is who. And this is where the 1840 thread connects to something vastly larger. If, at some point before the history we are permitted to study, a civilization existed that operated on a global scale, capable of construction in extreme environments, capable of leaving marks in stone that would still be legible to 19th century naval officers through centuries of accumulated ice and weathering, then the question isn't whether Antarctica was once inhabited. The question is when the inhabitation ended. And the question that follows is why every trace of it was so thoroughly, so consistently, so methodically erased. Not concealed by one government, not buried in one archive. Removed across languages, across institutions, across the official histories of nations that have spent centuries in mutual antagonism, yet somehow arrived at the same silence on this one subject. That uniformity of silence is, by itself, a kind of evidence. I want to come back to the human cost for a moment, because this isn't merely an archival puzzle. It is a story about what these voyages did to the people who sailed them. The frequency of psychological collapse among early Antarctic crews is not widely discussed in standard historical texts, but it is documented. Ship records from the Wilkes expedition describe multiple men suffering from what the surgeons of that era labeled polar madness, a catch-all diagnosis spanning anything from ordinary cabin fever to severe hallucinatory episodes. Some of these men described seeing things in the ice, cities, architecture, vast built forms. I understand the rational responses: isolation, oxygen deprivation, the crushing psychological weight of an environment no human was meant to endure. Fata Morgana, the well-documented mirage phenomenon in polar regions where distant ice formations can appear to take the shape of towers, ramparts, entire skylines. All real, all clinically established. I'm not dismissing any of it. But here is what I keep circling back to. The visions reported by these men were not random. They were not shapeless hallucinations projected onto blank whiteness. The architectural descriptions that survived in private letters, in unpublished journals, in the handful of accounts that briefly reached print before being quietly withdrawn, share a specific and consistent character. Immense scale, non-European proportions, stone, not wood or brick, layouts, suggesting not individual buildings but planned complexes, grids, districts, organized arrangements, and they described what they saw as buried, visible only in fragments, as though whatever they were perceiving, that whether through mirage, through madness, or through something else entirely, was merely the exposed edge of something incomprehensibly vast, still hidden beneath the ice. One officer, I won't identify him, as his descendants are still living, wrote in a private letter to his brother that he had observed from the deck of his ship a succession of walls running along a cliff face for a distance he could not estimate, bearing no resemblance to any feature he could attribute to wind or weather. He wrote that he reported this to his commanding officer. He wrote that he was instructed to remove it from his personal log. He wrote that he did not remove it from the letter. That letter was donated to a regional archive by his family in 1974. It has been referenced in exactly one academic paper. That paper appeared in a specialist journal that ceased publication 2 years later. What stays with me, the longer I sit with this material, is not any single anomaly. Taken alone, each piece is manageable. One redacted line, one coincidental expedition, one explorer's breakdown, one mysterious death, one cryptic letter. Any one of these, in isolation, is historical noise. Explainable, dismissible, it's the convergence, not the geology by itself, not the simultaneous voyages by themselves, not the censored reports by themselves, not the casualties by themselves, not the hallucinating crew by themselves, not the impossible maps by themselves. All of it pointing in one direction across a full century of Antarctic contact, across governments that despised each other, across languages and filing systems and institutional priorities that had every conceivable reason to compete and no obvious reason to cooperate, yet arriving at the same absence. The question isn't who gave the order. Perhaps no one did. Perhaps the silence generated itself the way certain truths, if they are large enough, if they are disruptive enough, create their own gravitational pull toward disappearance. Not conspiracy in the cinematic sense. Something quieter, something more distributed, something operating through the ordinary human impulse to preserve the version of reality that allows everything else to keep functioning. Because if what those expedition members witnessed was real, if the formations were architectural, if the scale was what the descriptions imply, if the geographic distribution traces something intentional, then the consequences don't end at Antarctica. They cascade backward through every timeline, every assumption about the age and origin and extent of human civilization. Every map, every founding narrative of every nation that ever dispatched ships toward that ice. Once you allow that possibility in, even provisionally, even as a question held at arm's length. Once you perceive the shape of what the evidence outlines, you begin to understand why the silence runs so deep and so wide and so old. 3 expeditions. 1 silence. What did they encounter along those frozen coastlines that compelled 3 rival nations independently to arrive at the same omission? What did the stone look like in those wind-scoured margins where the ice had been torn away, something that made seasoned naval officers reach for words they could never quite finish? Why do maps, drawn before the age of exploration, contain knowledge they should not possess? Why did the men who witnessed it most closely return, transformed? Some shattered, some mute, some dead, before anyone could properly ask them what they had seen. What is the connection between those geometric distributions and the ones researchers have been quietly documenting at dozens of other sites across the globe? The architectural consistencies, the impossible coordination, the civilization scale evidence that surfaces wherever someone is willing to look carefully enough and record what they actually observe rather than what they've been taught to expect. I don't have the answer. I say that without evasion. And I refuse to claim more than the evidence will bear. But I know what the evidence implies. I know what it feels like to read these accounts one after another, to watch the same void repeat across decades, across languages, across the institutional memories of governments that agree on almost nothing. It feels like a door that someone closed very deliberately a long time ago, and somewhere beyond it, beneath ice that has been thickening for centuries, above stone that may or may not have been shaped by hands we have no name for, the answer remains, waiting for whoever is willing to ask the question loudly enough to hear what comes back.